And you all had a conversation in your breakout rooms considering the reading. Um, the questions on the table were, what are the thesis of the reading? What does the wisdom teaching say about the people and the society that produced these teachings? And then finally, what was your favorite passage or wisdom teaching? Who would like to share what was discussed in their breakout rooms?
I can go first.
Okay, and then we'll go with Antonio.
So, like what we discussed was that. Let me see what's the question. So, like, we thought the thesis was it was just like live your life, like do like don't really focus on others and try to belittle them or interfere with their lives. Focus on your life and like do what God allows you to do. And if you'll be success, and if He permits that you'll be successful, then you'll be successful. And it was like, like if you have the power to do something, or like the wisdom or like the capability to speak, you have an obligation to do those things. And then for what the wisdom says about the community, from what I took from it, it just made it sound like the community was very focused on, bettering up themselves and the people around them. And they weren't really focused on, like, oh, well, this person has that, so I want that. They didn't really like, they just kind of lived their own lives, like I said before, and just help better themselves. And then my favorite passage was the one, I don't think I have it up right now, but it was the one where I talked about like if someone comes to you and tells you there are problems, and if you're someone that just cuts them off and tries to fix them, they don't really like that. And more times than less, they're trying to they feel that they're telling you their problems so their problems can be heard, not so their problems can be solved. And that resonated with me because me and my dad are both like that. So I think that was cool.
Yeah. Thank you. Antonio, you had your hand up?
Oh, okay. So in my group, we discussed that his thesis was to give advice about life, to be humble, to be selfless, and be compassionate to others. That's what we got. So what does the wisdom teaching say about the society that it was written? We say the society, it seems more compassionate, and it's an empathetic society teaching compassion and to be considerate of others. And my favorite passage of this teaching was the to steer against greed is passage 19. All guard against the vice of greed. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Antonio. Let's get one more before we move on. Who else would like to share? Daniel, what was discussed in your group? Daniel Gomez.
Our brothers are kind of like going a little bit crazy right now, so I can't talk too much.
Okay. You can throw it in the chat when you can. Matthew, how about you?
Can you repeat the question one more time, please?
Yeah, what was discussed in your breakout rooms?
Oh, well, I was in the same group as JW, so we did talked about the same type of things.
Okay, so what is your interpretation? What is your favorite passage?
My favorite passage is the one where it's number 10. It says, "If you are poor, then serve a person of words, so that your conduct may be well with God."
Okay.
I like that passage because even if you don't have a lot to offer, as long as you're kind to other people and you help them out, that's still like a good thing that you could do for them.
Thank you, Matthew. Okay, bet. So what I'll do is I'll jump into my notes for the reading, and then from there we'll move into our fishbowl. So this book, or this reading, is pulled from this book, The Teaching of Ptahhotep, the oldest book in the world. So this is quite literally the oldest wisdom teaching in the world. Now that shouldn't surprise most of you. If you think about African people being the first people on the planet, why is it surprising that African people would produce the first written text on the planet? Um, so a lot of where I'm going to pull from is going to be from the preface and the introduction of the text. You didn't have access to that, so don't feel bad. I'm going to kind of like fill in those blanks for you. Hopefully it'll help it make a lot more sense for you. So Ptahhotep was about 110 years old when he produced this text, okay? At the time, he was in track or in line to be the next pharaoh, but he chose to neglect the throne and pursue a more priestly calling, and he chose to be a priest. So not only does that speak to what is of value for Ptahhotep himself, but it gives you a little bit of insight into the Kemetic Mystery School Educational Society, right? So if you think about our lecture of last week and those columns that I showed you in the temporal images entrances with the pillars of with the statues going on the outside, right? That was the Kemetic University of Karnak. And when you went through this Kemetic University system, when you graduated, there was two end results, right? Either one, you would go into the world of politics, so you would become eventually a pharaoh, or two, you would go into the spiritual realm, like Ptahhotep, and you would become a priest or a sage. And Ptahhotep, he chose to be a sage, right? Okay. So the Medu Neter, right? It's the Africas, it's not only the Africas, but it's the world's first known written system. Okay. So oftentimes when you hear about the history of Africa, it's always positioned as an oral tradition, right? Africa has no written history, it's only an oral history. We know that this is not true because of this book here, right? The Medu Neter is the first written system in the history of the world, right? And then what it says in the text, that when they found this written system, there's no evidence of a developmental stage, right? So when they uncovered this written system, they found it completely intact, right? So there's no development of this system. So that becomes of importance. Let's see here. I'll skip past that for sake of time. So it can be argued, right? But here, I'm gonna just read this. The instructions of Ptahhotep were copied during the Middle Kingdom on papyri that are still preserved. Some Egyptologists believe that because the instructions were attributed to Ptahhotep, and because there was indeed Old Kingdom sage by that name, and because Middle Kingdom writers attributed the sayings to that sage, who is said to have served under King Asa of the 5th dynasty, therefore they should accept that attribution in the absence of compelling evidence to the contrary. Even if it were Middle Kingdom material at an age of the 12th dynasty, approximately 2000 BC, it would still be the oldest wisdom literature in the world. Giving a 5th dynastic age, we can say that the instructions of Ptahhotep belong to a period approximately 2,500 years before Christ, okay? So they're saying due to this evidence that was found, or to not enough sufficient evidence to the contrary, they could argue that the teaching of Ptahhotep can be traced back at least 2,500 years prior to Christ, okay? So you would have to say that these teachings and these wisdom texts proceed that of the Bible. Okay. Okay. So a couple of things as you kind of get into the actual reading that you guys had, right? And I'm looking at the very bottom of page 16. And for me, there's a very strong sense of the oral, right? The auditory, and then the ability to listen and to hear takes very much of a precedent in what Ptahhotep wants to do, right? And at the bottom of page 16, this is Ptahhotep speaking to what they believe is King Asa, right? May your servant be authorized to use the status that old age affords. Remember, he's 110 years old when he wrote this, right? So he's saying, let me use my 110 years of experience to do something for the people, right? Let me teach the hearers, okay? So one, we have listening. He wants to teach the hearers so as to tell them, speech, the words, speech, of those who have listened to the ways of our ancestors and those who have listened to the gods. May I do this for you so that strife may be banned from among our people and so that the two shores may serve you. Now, what is strife? Somebody tell me what strife is.
It's like struggle,
Yep.
like unease.
Mm-hmm. Struggle, hardship, beef, bickering, right? So what he's essentially saying is, let me use my 110 years of experience and wisdom to put something on paper that will show this society how to eliminate or how to do away with this idea or this notion of strife, right? How they could interact with each other on a level that's wholesome and harmonious, okay? So for me, that's the thesis. That's the thesis right there. He wants to use his wisdom to produce a society that does not deal with strife, okay? Now I'm looking at the page 17, the second full paragraph. He says, and so begins the formulations of Mentor Nefer, good speech, right? So Mentor Nefer, MDW, NFR is good speech, okay? And so it begins the formulations of Mentor Nefer, good speech to be spoken by the prince, the count, God's beloved, the eldest son of the Pharaoh, the son of his body, mayor of the city, and vizier. Ptahhotep instructs the ignorant in the knowledge and the standards of good speech. It will profit those who hear. It will be a loss to those who transgress. Ptahhotep begins to speak to Pharaoh's son to prosperity, right? So how Ptahhotep seeks to eliminate this idea of strife from the society is by establishing good speech, right? So the idea is, if when I speak to Melanie, I speak to her in a positive way. When Melanie speaks to Antonia, she's speaking to her in a positive way. When JW and Michael interact with one another, they're speaking to each other positively. When Cole and Jaime speak to one another, they speak to each other positively, right? So Ptahhotep is overly concerned with how that society speaks and interacts with one another. And with this being his concerns, he gives you the wisdom teaching that you find on the subsequent page, right? So one thing to think about, not only is Ptahhotep concerned with how we speak to one another and how we treat one another, another way of thinking about this, he's concerned with the relations of the society, right? And we know that the root relations is the root word of relationships, right? So he's concerned with how the members of the society relate to one another. And that relation, again, keeping in line with Ma'at, right? Because Ma'at is about what? Truth, justice, harmony, right? Harmony, balance, order, reciprocity, and propriety. He's making sure that this society relates to one another in accordance with the principles of Ma'at. Okay? So those are my notes for the reading. From here, we'll move into our fishbowl. Again, for your fishbowl, you have to go twice a semester. You have one time to pass. You could literally talk about what was discussed in your breakout rooms. You could read your journal verbatim, or you could discuss anything that I mentioned in my notes here, right? So you have three spheres of conversation to pull from to engage in your fishbowl. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer for the fishbowl?
I'll go.
Okay, Hyman, I got you. Anyone else?
I could go.
Okay, Michael, thank you. Anyone else? One more volunteer at most. If not, I could call on people.
I'll go.
I'm sorry, who? JW? Got you.
Yeah.
All right, whoever wants to start it off, it's on you. We have Jaime, Michael, and JW.
I can handle first. I'll do it first. Okay, so when I was reading the reading for Ptahhotep, I feel like when I was reading through it, I feel like one thing like it just came to me where a part what he said, if you're gonna send a person of trust by sent by another great person, be careful to stick to the essence. And then I forgot what else he says, but what's it called? I think that I feel like now it's hard to trust a certain amount of people and stuff, because I feel like as soon as you break trust with somebody, I don't feel like you don't get that trust back no more. And I think that's a big problem that we have here, that someone could say, oh, trust me on this and this and this, but then they do stuff behind your back. And I feel like this is what he's saying and stuff when he said about send a message, to send it correctly, not send it and say something else, because he could say something else and say something messed up about him and stuff. And that's what I got out, and that's what like really like came to me.
So really, I want to point out real quick before you jump into the next one. Two things that Jaime did, right? He showed you his analysis, right? Because he said actually his analysis as well as his contemporary analysis, right? Because for him, what allowed him to make sense of this passage was Ptahhotep is talking about trust, and then he relates it to, which is his analysis, right? And then he relates it to now, and he says, oftentimes and nowadays, someone can tell you to believe me about something, and then they can run it behind your back and not act upon that trust that they try to instill within you, right? So not only is he demonstrating his analysis, how he made sense of the reading, but how he was able to bring the reading that was written 2,500 years prior to Christ into our moment now in 2022, right? Also, this idea, have y'all familiar with the game called like telephone, right? Where you say one message and you turn. So this is what Ptahhotep's talking about. Don't do the telephone shit, right? So if I tell you something, deliver the message just as I told you to deliver it. And think about the context of what he's saying. So if we have two pharaohs, right? And one pharaoh wants to send a message to another pharaoh, and he sends his messenger to go send the message, right? If that message gets misinterpreted, that could lead to war, right? That could lead to strife. So be sure that you carry this message with the exact same accuracy and intention of the way that you received it. So that way there's no misrepresentation of what one leader may say to another leader, right? So that's the practical importance of what Ptahhotep is saying. Who's next? We have Michael and JW.
I got you. I can go next. My analysis for the whole Ptahhotep's reading is basically around the idea of how much the ideologies and morals have changed over time. So first off, I noticed that there was a lot of masculine terminology. I believe it was the last passage that mentioned the wife, make the wife happy. That definitely that doesn't apply now. Well, it does, but to a certain degree that it involves everyone. Another change over time was I forgot the exact passage, but it was the follow your heart one. The follow your heart and do not do more than what you're told. The idea of independency actually kind of surprised me that it was thought about then, but not to its full potential of how it's now. Nowadays, we can follow our hearts to its true potential, doing more than what is asked, doing more than what we're told to do. We have no limits now.
Michael, do you remember which number the follow your heart passage was? I want to read that because
I got you. I could look. I'm looking at the number 11.
11. Thank you, Cole. Thank you, Michael. I'm gonna just read that to everyone just so we kind of know, because I think this is really profound, right? And I'm gonna kind of unpack this a little bit. Follow your heart as long as you live. Do no more than is required. Do not shorten the time of follow your heart, since that offends the Ka, right? And so the Ka, that's another word of thinking about the soul, right? So the soul and the Ka are interchangeable, okay? Don't waste time on daily cares over and beyond providing for your household. When wealth finally comes, then follow your heart. Wealth does no good if you're glum, right? And to me, that's very profound. So let's think about this idea of follow your heart. How many of you all are going to school to do something that your heart desires? Please raise your hand. Okay, so Cole, JW, Australia, Melanie, Ashanti, Antonio, Carlos. So few of you, right? Few of you are going to school to follow your heart's desires, right? I would assume those who did not raise your hand, and correct me if I'm wrong, are probably going to school to get a degree, to get a good job. Oftentimes, they're in conflict, this idea of getting a good job and following what your heart desires, right? But if you listen to Ptahhotep, right, he's saying you could get the bag still. It's not, they're not mutually exclusive, right? Because he's telling you to follow your heart. Follow your heart. Do no more than is required of you to provide for your family, right? But then, when the wealth finally comes, it may take you some time, but it's going to come. What does he tell you to do? Follow your heart, right? So where we have been trained in this society, kind of going off of what Michael's analysis is, like what has changed over time, right? How did we go from these values to the values that we have now, right? And the values that we have now will tell you to go to school, get a job, right? Accumulate wealth. That's what your heart should desire. But the ancient commanders are saying, nah, there's much more to life than just that, right? Find what your heart desires and follow that. Even when the bad comes, continue to do what your heart desires, because wealth does no good if you're glum. How many people in our world are rich beyond measure but are unhappy? It's very common. Very common. He's telling you to follow your heart. JW?
So my analysis for it, it was a big one that stuck out to me. It was like, if you're wealthy, then like, don't live in that wealth. But, you know, it's like, look back to where you were before that. And to me, that kind of speaks about, you know, being humble and being proud of where you came from. Because like nowadays, you know, you have so many, it's like, you know, multimillionaires, hell, like, you know, even multi-billionaires that just kind of spend money on just like whatever. And it's like, you know, it's like they have the power and money to make a difference in the world, and they don't. They just spend it on, you know, fancy cars and fancy clothes. Or there was another one that stuck to me, and it was it was like, don't let, you know, like that overconfidence get to you. You know, it's like, be like, and again, it's like relating back to being humble. It's like, you know, if you're succeeding, don't go out and boast about it, you know, and just know that you're succeeding, and that should be enough. You know, it's like, you don't need to go tell everyone, oh, I'm achieving this. You know, your achievements will speak for themselves. And to me, that stuck out to me a lot, because like, you know, like in today's world, everyone's, you know, on Instagram posting about, yeah, I just bought this car, yeah, I just, you know, did this, did that. And it's, you have so very few people that, you know, are just like, yeah, you know, like I did this a while ago. Oh, I didn't know about it. Oh yeah, because, you know, it's like I didn't post about it. Doesn't matter. And like, to me, that's where I want to get to, is just like that mind state where it's like, you know, I don't need to boast about my achievements. Like the fact that I achieved it is already good enough for me.
Absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right, JW, in the sense that a lot of these teachings center around this idea of humbleness, right? No matter what your position is in life, whether you're a leader, whether you're a judge, whether you're rich, you're going to remain humble, right? And even instructions for those who are not rich on how to remain humble, even in your lowly state. So humbleness becomes a very keen um, focal point for these teachings. So for JW, Michael, and Jaime, you've done this before, but for predominantly JW and Michael, this is our first fishbowl. How did you feel about the fishbowl process?
You wanna go?
Oh, you go, Michael.
Okay, sure. It was pretty self-explanatory for me. I pretty much just looked at my journal that I wrote prior. I just kind of just took what your notes and just combined it all and just let my mouth speak and see where it got me.
JW?
For me, it's nice to be able to share everything, and you know, just like if you have like thoughts, you can share with your peers and just get that out there. And kind of like what Michael said, you know, it's just like listen to everyone else talk, you know, got me inspired to speak about my beliefs in this. And so I just thought it was a really cool opportunity.
Cool. So it's not too strenuous, right? It's nothing too difficult. It's nothing that you have to do a lot to prepare for. If you do the reading and you do the journal and you participate in the breakout rooms, you should be prepared to fishbowl. So for here, we'll move into our broader classroom conversation around the materials, and we'll kind of incorporate everyone within this conversation. So I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts about the readings, thoughts about things that may have stood out. Um, One thing that Michael mentioned was the role of women in the text. The language is very male centered, right? I don't believe he uses women until like the latter half of the wisdom teachings. That's something I'm very interested to talk about as well. But we don't have to move on what my interest is. I want to hear from you all. So, what were your thoughts?
I was struck by like how kind of like lyrical and beautiful some of these were, where a lot of them were kind of like instructional, and then there was the one like number 18 where says like 1,000 good men are turned away from their good because of a short moment that is like a dream, and then that moment is followed by death and become that comes from having known that dream. Just like I just thought it was really beautiful.
Yeah.
And number 11 I thought was really beautiful too.
You know, Cole, you're absolutely right. And if we think back to the lecture we had last week, and I was talking about those columns in particular, right? And they had twofold purpose. One was the aesthetics, right? Like just a beautiful looking piece of art or a piece of architecture, but then like the instructional aspect of them. And Cole, you're picking up right on that within the text itself, right? Like not only is it very instructive, right? And not only does it tell you how to live through life, but the way that it's written is very poetic in a sense, right? It has its own art within itself. And what Cole is picking up on, and typically I get into this conversation a little bit later in the semester, but when you read, right, yes, it's what's being said that becomes important, but also pay attention to how it's being said. And Cole is attentive to the style of Ptahhotep's writing, right? For me, when we get into writers like Baldwin, there's a particular style in the way that James Baldwin will put a sentence together that becomes very interesting. So as we move throughout the semester, we'll kind of get into more conversations about different levels to read at, right? Because there's multiple ways that you kind of engage in this process of reading. Who else? Perla, what were your thoughts?
I actually didn't read it because I forgot we had to, but I was going through it right now, and it's pretty interesting, like what they say, you know.
Yeah. So what do you find interesting based off what you saw?
I think it was one about like where you follow your heart. The one you guys are discussing, number 11.
Okay. So let me ask you all this: what would our society be like today, right? If we're gonna like take our third component of our journal, the contemporary analysis, what would our society look like if we were to take these teachings and our society would be structured around these teachings? So say, for example, instead of us having the Constitution, right, we operated off of these teachings. What would our society look and feel like? What do you think?
I feel like it'd be like a lot more peaceful and just because I mean it's like, you know, if everyone were to just focus on themselves instead of, you know, gossiping about like what celebrities are doing or being envious about, you know, what Timmy down the street has, what he got for Christmas and what you didn't get for Christmas. It's like, you know, you're so much more determined to just focus on yourself and inspire the people around you and help them where you can, that, you know, it's not just a constant battle with your peers to see, you know, who can gain the more wealth or who can be quote unquote better.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is less materialistic is what one of the things I'm hearing within your conversation, JW.
Yeah, less materialism and just like more of like a better view on like what's truly important to you instead of just like what society says is important, you know, it's
Absolutely.
stuff like that.
Ashanti, were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I think I agree with JW. I think it would be more like humility because a lot of the teachings are about being silent and listening. And the first four in particular, which I really like, we're talking about like, don't, if you see someone equal to you, just let them talk and you will rise on top. If you see someone weaker than you, don't try to overpower them, because then you will look like the fool. And then the one about if someone is more powerful than you, let them, again, just let them speak and then you'll still come out on top. I think if people just like are silent and listen more and actually like conversate with each other, there would be like a lot less stuff that's going on right now.
I agree. I'm looking at the chat. Australia, you're saying that mental health would be more of a priority. Can you extrapolate on that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, so my favorite passage was 17, and it talked about how sometimes I'll quote it. It says, "A good hearing soothes the heart," and I feel like we can resonate a lot with that now. I'm saying like mental health would be more of a priority, only because like back then, like they had a higher regard for a person's values versus like now it's all about vanity. And if we were to incorporate that, like we wouldn't be having such high population of people with mental illnesses now. And that's what I got from the reading.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Australia. And I think maybe what it would do is create a circumstance where mental health would not have to be such a priority, right? Because society is kind of conducted in a way that your mental health is already at the forefront of what people do that's normal, right? So you don't have to create like these mechanisms to support people who are going through stressful situations, right? Because if you think about it, mental health in this society becomes a priority because we have normalized stressful situations that erode our mental health. Does that make sense? Right? So if we're able to eliminate those stressful situations, it just creates an environment in society that's always engaging in practices of mental health. Carlos, you're really going off in the chat, and they're all directed to me. Why don't you articulate some of the things that you're saying in the chat to your students, because it's really good points. Okay, so I'm gonna just read. So keep in mind though, Carlos, you're gonna have to talk for your fishbowl. But some of the things that Carlos is pointing out, right? He's saying he feels that society would be more peaceful and more and kind of situate itself in more equality and a better understanding between one another. And again, to me, that's the key point, right? This creating the better understanding between one another. That's the thesis of this reading, right? This idea and this concept of relations, how we relate to one another. And what Carlos is saying is if we were to structure our society based on these teachings, we would create a society that's focused on positive relations. And I would agree. What I want to do before we close things out, I want to have a quick conversation, kind of going back to what Michael had mentioned in regards to the language being very male dominated. I'm going to read passage 21, and I want to ask the question. Before I do that, let me contextualize where I'm going with this. So in last week's conversation, in last week's lecture, I talked about how women in the ancient Kemetic society were able to rule with the same power, with the same authority, and with the same might as men, right? That's the claim that I make. Now, looking at this reading, right, one could argue that that may not be the truth based on the language within this text and based on how women are kind of subjective in the text, right? They're not placed in the center. They're kind of placed on the periphery. And I get to passage number 21. And I'm going to read that. When you prosper, establish your home, love your wife with adore. So like to adore your wife with adoration, right? Then fill her belly and clothe her back. Caress her. Give her ornaments to soothe her body. Fulfill her wishes for as long as you live. She is a fertile field for her husband. Do not be brutal. Good manners will influence her better than force. Do not contend with her in the courts. Keep her from the need to resort to outside powers. Her eye is her storm when she gazes. It is by such treatment that she will be compelled to stay in your house. Now, let me ask you, does this passage paint women with agency, or do they paint women as being subjective to the will of the men? Is my question. Does this paint women with agency, or does this paint women to be subjective to the will of men?
Like it paints them as more something to be like adored and like respected more than just like, oh, like you'll do what I say, you know, like you do this, you do that. Like in most early societies where it was like the men had the hierarchy. I guess when paints them more as, you know, it's like that's a prize, that's something you protect. That's not something you just, and like it's like, you know, like don't be abusive. So it's like they're not, it's not quote unquote property as most civilizations treated them before. It was just, you know, it's like it's truly just like, you know, like how you treat, like I guess like how you should treat a woman.
Australia put in the chat subjective. Why do you feel it's subjective, Australia?
I feel like the passage implies that women should be complacent, and to prevent from a woman becoming like rebellious, you should try to please her as much as you can, but not too much to want to encourage her to try to create her own agency.
Does anybody agree with Australia? And I'm really more so curious to hear what the women think about the passage, because I don't want to have any mansplaining about what we think it is. But does anyone agree or disagree? Particularly, I'm asking the women with Australia's pontification.
I agree with Estrella's analysis because it's also a passage here. She's a fertile field. I find that as like they saw women as a birth machine. That's the role of a wife is, which is in this society, it still is, but it's we view it differently. Yeah.
So when I initially got to this part of the passage, right, I thought the same thing, but I had to kind of take a step back and do a reread. Now, excuse my positionality as a man, and I don't want to like mansplain over what these two women said about the passage, but this is my interpretation, right? And this is why I do not feel that it's subjectifying women, because there are elements of the women's agency, okay? So first, get your money up, right? Because when you prosper, so get your money right, and then get your home, okay? Once those things are established, adore your wife. Make sure she ain't hungry. Make sure she has clothes on her back, right? Caress her. Give her them back massages. Give her them earrings. Give her them rings, right? Whatever her wish is, you fulfill that wish for as long as you live. Her fertility. Antonia's right. She's talking about her ability to reproduce, right? She's a fertile field for her husband, okay? Do not be brutal. Treat her with kindness, because that's better than force. Keep her from the need to resort from outside powers, okay? Now here comes the agency. Her eye is her storm when she gazes. It is by such treatment that she will be compelled to stay in your house, right? So to me, this is where the agency comes in at. One, if you read closely, the woman has the option to stay within that house or not, right? And if you're fucking up, it's within her right to go seek those outside forces. Because if you ain't doing it right, she's more within her right to find a man who can, right? That's agency. And then where it really gets fecund, her eye is her storm when she gazes. I don't know about how many of y'all, where you're at in your relationship status, but I've been in a relationship with my fiance I've known her for 19 years, right? And what I know is when she gets mad and that storm in her eye starts to brew, all shit is fucked up, right? All shit is fucked up. So this is speaking to the power of the woman. And for me, it's not more so about policing the woman's behavior, but it's about policing the man's behavior on how to appropriately position yourself to be an effective husband, right? So this is not a teachings to mitigate or to restrict the women's behavior and movement, but it's instructions on how to appropriately interact with women if you call yourself ready to be a man. And to me, this is why it's not a subjective text. I kind of lean to what JW was saying is it puts women on the proper pedestal that they should be placed on. And anything that's of value, you have to treat a certain way, right? You don't just treat diamonds like you treat silver, right? You got a limited edition pair of J's, you ain't gonna rock them like you're gonna rock a pair of regular ass Adidas, right? So things with certain value, you're gonna treat differently. And what Ptahhotep is trying to get the readers to say, and this is why I also think it's couched in such male language, because it's instructing men on how to treat women, not the other way around. So we'll call it a day here. Is there any last minute questions, comments, or concerns? Okay, let me show you all what your reading is for next week. If you do have questions, go ahead, feel free to shout them out while I get this pulled up. Also, this will be the flow of our class from week to week going forward. So it'll be structured in the very same way. Okay. So for next week, and I'll email this out to you all by Thursday, we're going to read Africans and Their History, Myths and Stereotypes. It's 10 pages. So you'll read that and you'll produce a journal for this one, and then we will go through the same format as we did today for this reading next week, and then we'll go from there. As I mentioned, I will email this out to you all by end of Thursday at latest Friday. But if you want to start with it now, if you go to Google Classroom under weeks 1 through 4, it's here, Africans and Their History, and you can find that reading. Again, tomorrow there is an extra credit opportunity. The film Ferguson Rises will be available via that Zoom link that's on the Google Classroom site. If you do a journal entry, you will get a extra credit. So Rizek, it's the Africans and Their History, Stereotypes and Myths. So it's this one here. Wednesday's extra credit is offered by the Pan-African Studies Department, Bolo Kaja, the conversation event. So if you make that, you also will get extra credit. Mike, just hang out for me when we hang out, and then we can ask that question. Other than that, you all be healthy, be wealthy, be wise, get your exercise.